Okay, so this isn't really a very sophisticated video that I'm putting together here. I'm just going to read a story to you. There's going to be a lot of editing in it because my voice isn't really 100%. But I'm going to read this story to you, and I hope that you can hang on because it's really, I think, a beautiful story, if I do say so myself. It's a story about an old man who struggles with his memory. He is lonely, and the name of the book is Winter Heart, The Death of Santa Claus. The snow's crust gave way to the weight of his boots and snapped the quiet beneath as he stepped from the sleigh's rail. The old man groaned as he pressed both hands against the small of his back, raising his face toward the thin layer of clouds high above. They were slipping across the sky in an easterly direction, giving the occasional revealing of the stars. He sensed another headache coming on. He knew the physical and emotional cost of continuing this ancient tradition. Is it all for nothing? He asked himself frequently. A small part of him still longed for this night. Nevertheless, the battle between weariness and joy was an unending one these days. And even the thought of a child somewhere out there wishing for a sign that someone loved them only slightly outweighed the alternative as of late. This used to be so much more, he said as he walked to the front of his team. Buckle by buckle, he released the breast collars, and one by one, they stepped out of the way toward the forest's edge. So much more, he confessed to his friend. Pausing for a moment, he pressed his hand against the side of his ear to relieve the advancing pain. The exhausted reindeer all panted heavily, painting the slightly lit tree line with silhouettes of water vapor. They seemed eager for their master to release them on that evening, a bit restless. Still, they stood, patiently waiting for his command. With an about face and a shimmy, he dropped the stale red coat from his shoulders and tossed the tattered thing onto a nail that had been fastened to the side of the barn from the barn's beginning. He turned back again, paused, and waved his hand toward the small herd, and with a jolt, their countenance changed. It was always the same response, he noticed, as they had returned to their wild state, leaving their obedience behind, their assigned purpose behind. What once used to be a magical reawakening, an annual ritual to behold, was now, to the old man, only caribou being startled from their imprisonment of this holiday's black magic. Suddenly, one jumped into the trees, leaving the others. The rest kept their eyes on the old man. But the delay was only for a moment, as they all quickly followed and plunged into the thick. He stood, alone. And with a dismissive waft of his hand, he said, "Okay, Merry Christmas," only loud enough for himself to hear. He turned to see the leather straps and metal bits lying there. Then again toward the rickety shelter, he pulled his coat from the nail and popped through the snow. He concluded. The barn he entered is where he had donned this red identity for the last 6 years. 7 years ago, on this pre-dawn gray hour, he'd begun sketching out what he'd soon be building, as a craftsman would if that craftsman were given the opportunity. An armoire just for this special clothing, for this special time of the year. Initially, its place was to be in the house, to stand between the two south-facing windows of their bedroom, the room he and his love had shared so many years. But there it was, frozen in sorrow, having only known barn life. Its handles were beginning to rust, and the wood was swollen and cracked, accelerating its age. The floral design in the doors had turned mostly black from mold, and there was an unsightly dark stain on the side. The mold isn't a typical thing to see in this area of the world, but the past 2 summers had given continuous rain and unusually high temperatures. He blamed the piece itself for being in a barn instead of its rightful location. His accusation toward this wooden thing was seasoned with deep hurt and with anger. A dusting of snow had found the edges of his misplaced work. Evidently, it had blown in through the missing roof slats that would have been just above. Examining the sky through the hole, he noticed some snow clouds had begun to arrive. He'd seen them from above. He was expecting them. Blast it, he angrily cursed, as if they'd blown in to spite him. Tea in a dead rose. He waited for the water to boil. Impatiently, he lifted the pot to check that the fire was still burning. He had done this 3 times before already. Disgruntled, he walked to the window and pulled the curtain back to look outside. The silence was interrupted by the steady thump of the screen door blowing in the wind. The snow had been falling relentlessly that evening, and he knew most would give credit to the many variables within the evidence provided by science for such weather. But the old man believed a bit differently than most. He held that it was a balance of things due partly to the life given him. The majority of his notion had factors consisting of science, universal bias, and deliberate design. As to how many parts each were responsible for the makeup of his existence, that he did not know for certain. For that matter, he didn't believe anyone knew. These last years especially, he speculated that the majority leaned toward the holy divine. He'd enjoyed a rich life, a life filled with praise, abundance, and what seemed to be, during its time, never-ending good health. He reasoned that having the honor to partake in these good things had hidden consequences of their own, and the weight of these things had become so heavy on his side of the scale that a correction was sure to come sooner or later. And it did come. It was as if the Creator called in the debt on a loan for which the old man did not ask. Still yet, it was time to settle. Aromas of cinnamon and nutmeg in this dwelling had been replaced with the smell of many things that had turned rank. The earthy dampness wasn't satisfied with its place in the outdoors. It had navigated its way into the house through the various neglected openings. The house itself wasn't all that old, really. In the 70s, they'd taken advantage of a generous offer on their Arctic property due to pipeline construction advancing its way through the tundra. They moved into the mountainous south. The missus wanted to move even closer to civilization, but the old man was stubborn about his desperate need for privacy. Inside, most everything stayed the same the past 6 years, at least in the same place. One would have to confess that this is the nature of a home ignored. The rose had dried up long before. It had become petrified in the waterless vase, which sat upon the same dust-blanketed windowsill. She had placed the flower, he thought. She must have. But he couldn't recall her name, causing his body to ache. His eyes would regularly scan this scene of familiarity. He fussed to no one that there were so many photos on the wall of people he didn't even know. He didn't care enough, however, to remove them. His study stopped once reaching the rifle that rested against the side of the refrigerator. The screen door stopped, he thought as he glanced toward the back of the house, noticing the occasional wind-driven rhythm was no more. The snow, he concluded. It must have drifted into a doorstop. His fingertips slowly approached the withered and brittle flower. He leapt slightly at the teapot's whistle, looking toward the sound. he grunted as he shuffled toward the collie. A final preparation. He fidgeted with the last fold of the collar, leaving it flawless for inspection. There was no doubt that this was the famous coat worn by her, his one and only. And there was no doubt the old man who loved her had placed it there. The old man whose heart had fallen into an inescapable grasp, one which cried in unwanted solitude and painful echoes of his many days. He'd spent far more than a fair bit of time cleaning the kitchen table, provided it was one of the few things he kept in order in the home. That table. It was given to them by her father on the day they moved into this home. He'd even removed the little wooden car, which used to have the purpose of holding down a short stack of napkins, and the salt and pepper shakers from the center, and placed them in the cabinet. Countless times they'd shared one another's hearts over this simple piece of furniture. A slight bit of resentment drifted through him as he became reminded of the armoire that never made it indoors. With both hands he pressed to feel the fabric one last time. He left it there that day. He hoped it would be found by someone who cared to find it. Not that someone would come looking for him or his bride necessarily, except that someone may come looking for the source of Christmas morning benefits that had blessed their generation and generations past. That these material traditions had suddenly come to a halt. Then, with a pop of deliberate action, he turned, grabbed the rifle, pushed open the screen door, using it as a snowplow, and made his way toward the barn. A forest, a mountain, and a trail. It took only a few moments for his breathing to become heavy and cold as he trudged through the snow. He'd only made it to the barn, and he was already tugging upward on his heavy gloves and downward on his stocking cap. With a final determination, he walked into the tree line, passing the freshly blanketed hemlock and spruce trees on his left, then his right, and then his left again. He navigated as straight a line as he knew how, deeper into the evergreen forest with the white floor. He tapped the trees with the barrel of his rifle as he walked by each one. Finally, after a time, close to the bottom of the last mountain to pass, he'd come to the trail. It was wide, easy to navigate, and straight in most parts. Occasionally it would narrow with the evergreen walls closing in on the hiker. The next mountain was the most important, not to climb, but to see. And no traveler could see it until the forest's end. It was here, toward the end of the walk, when weeping was what he desired to do. But he refused. It wasn't the time to cry. There was an appointment he had to keep, and there was a job to do. Just a little further. Glass Falls and the Cross. The forest came to an end and unveiled a great and vast land. The rarely seen top of the mountain seemed to enter the sky due to the clouds. At its base was a small lake, and above the lake to the east was a river which fed it, and from the side of the mountain graced a fantastic waterfall. They named it Glass Falls, for during their first visit the falls were frozen and sparkled a perfect sun and blue sky within them. And on that day, they beheld the highest tip of that mountain. He stood trying to will the clouds away with his memories, but only in vain. On the north side of the river, a 10-minute hike, was a small cluster of trees. It was there he pledged his life to her so many laughs, prayers, and tears ago. And there now, within the trees, stood a cross, waist high and leaning a bit, half covered in a drift of fresh snow. As he pressed toward the hallowed ground, each step as a vice on a stone, nearly unbearable. Emotion blurred his sight as he dropped his rifle and fell to his knees. The pain, a familiar anguish, was expanding within his chest as if she'd just died. He sounded through his inability to speak. He'd had so many rambling memories accompanying him on his walk there. But suddenly, those memories were no more. The ability to control any remembrance of her had turned sullen. Stealing his gaze was the presence of something unseeable. Someone or something. He did not know which. This strange magnetic influence that surrounded the area was undeniable. Then, seemingly against his will, he was reminded that this presence used to hear his voice when he cried in the dark. Someone he had loved, whom he had feared. Then, as he trembled and wept for a time, this, whoever it was, showed the old man mercy. And he was given a perfect vision of her face. She looked at him with a deep gaze, one of eternal love and pity. It was how she was toward the end. Even without her hair and with dark circles beneath her eyes, she was feminine. And she was lovely. And through this beauty, she possessed the ability to convey kindness and conviction simultaneously. He reached to grab the rifle. He pressed the gun's stock against the cross's top edge and pulled down to scrape the snow away. And then again and again until it was clean. "Remember the letter," it read. The old man's unkempt gray eyebrows pressed together. "The letter?" he questioned in his thought. Pausing, he then remembered. The letter. The day he laid her to rest was a terrible one, for on that day he'd pulled a sled through blizzard conditions to reach this sacred place. And once there on that sad day, he dug through snow and ice, battling the constant drifts until he could finally chip his way into the cold, frozen earth. He'd lost track of time, but his memory told him it was an all-day nightmare. His bride waited patiently in the handmade cedar box, and per her instruction, he dug a second grave next to it, a tiny one, only big enough to fit a plastic bowl with a snap-on lid. Within the bowl was a jar, and within the jar was a note from her. The letter. Dear Henry. Henry, he recalled. I'm Henry. A hint of a smile touched the corners of his mustache and ice-covered mouth, and just as quickly, the smile dropped into an expression of embarrassment and disappointment. He'd taken from himself the right to be happy about anything long ago. I've decided to write this letter to you, that you would know from time to time as you visit me beyond the trees that you are loved, that you have a remarkable ability given by God to love others. Whether it's making us tea on a cold night, playing Santa for the children at Christmas, of course I was a pretty fantastic Mrs. Claus, or building toys and furniture for those less fortunate. If anything good came from the workshop accident that night, it was that you somehow forgot all the bad in me and the trials we've had through our marriage. Somehow, through the times of my illness, you've managed only to remember the good in me. So, since I cannot change what has happened to you, I choose to be thankful. But there is one thing that troubles me as I approach the time of my crossover. Each day that goes by, I see that your faith is becoming more and more elusive to you. On one hand, I see the special love you have for me. Then on the other, I am saddened by the bitterness you have inwardly, and you've become disappointed when you look at your new, limited self, that you've become disappointed in the God who saved you. I pray through our Lord and by the power of the Spirit of God that the Father would show mercy and grace abundantly in your life after I'm gone. Oh, I do hope you move down south into the city, my love, that you would be near other people, even strangers, to care for you, to look out for you. But that hope is wasted, I suppose. You've always been bound to the wilderness, and it's always been bound to you. Anyway, hold on to the scripture verses that we've always held on to together for so many years. Do you remember what Paul wrote? Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and... Henry remembered and spoke. Gentleness with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Ephesians 4, 1 through 3. And he remembered her name. Rosaline, he said affectionately. He stretched over to touch the cross, then pulled the glove from his hand, and he reached beneath his stocking cap, pressing carefully that he could feel the scar above his ear. He followed it up to the other end, just at the crown of his head, remembering those endless days that seemed like torture as he was a slave to a hospital bed while Rosaline went through her chemotherapy and care alone. He returned to the letter. There is a good home out there somewhere for the armoire you made for me. Did I ever tell you that your heart shows through your work? I couldn't be more proud of the man I married. And I think this piece is the best you've ever crafted. Please find it in yourself to let it go. Mr. Penny said that for him to continue ordering the nuts and fruits for our visitors, we need to pay in advance. Just be sure to get enough that will last until your next trip into town. They eat more of our freebies in the winter. Ha! He exclaimed, remembering how he complained about the amount of food Rosaline gave to the deer. He brushed a tear from his cheek with the back of his wrist. Don't forget to ask him to order flowers, too. They're expensive, but fresh cut flowers in the winter will make you feel better. I love you forever. Live your life. We'll be together again before you know it. A never-ending love. Rose. P.S. Put this back in the ground now. Henry was careful as he folded the worn letter and returned it to the capsule. I miss you, Rose. Saint Nick. Henry placed a fresh-cut rose into a clean vase on the table with extra care. They stood next to the salt and pepper shakers. He set the little wooden car next to the fireplace. This is where Rose had placed it after he built this first little toy. He nodded toward the flower to agree with its placement as he grabbed a roll of masking tape. He ripped 2 pieces from it, each about a finger's length. Rose was to be written on one and Henry on the other. Today he was going to stick them accordingly onto the glass of their wedding picture in the hallway. He fumbled through the drawer for a time, looking for a permanent marker. The pop whistled. It seized his thought. He stood a bit confused and rested his fingers on the edge of the drawer, setting his gaze upon the folded coat. Then he found himself wondering what it was he was doing there in that drawer. Tomorrow's Christmas. I need to get the sleigh ready, he whispered. He closed the drawer and shuffled to the other side of the kitchen, grabbed a teacup and a saucer just after a cup of tea. The end.